probably thousands, at least 2,000.
Probably 1,000.
There are several thousands of organizations that work to prevent human trafficking. Millions of people are trafficked per year, but those organizations are slowly working to decrease the number of trafficked victims.
No, I'm not.
Maybe once, but I don't know what he did.
There's Joseph Coney.
Joseph Coney, along with many others, are the reasons people have to go through the rehabilitation process, because of their experience as trafficked victims.
Maybe just like kind of people showing them how, I don't know, maybe just how things work. Like how, because they've probably been like kind of like scarred in a way. So like maybe they're just going through people showing them how the world still is and how it's not the same as what they saw, maybe.
Probably some sort of rehabilitation, but they probably have some mental disease or something that has to be cured.
I don't know.
We are fortunate to be able to conduct an interview with Ms. Emily Posnock-Lapchik, a representative from UNICEF who specializes in human trafficking. She was able to further our knowledge and education on what the rehabilitation process looks like for trafficked victims around the world.
But a lot of the work that UNICEF is doing is both working with the government to pass legislation and make sure that legislation is enforced, to make sure that children are protected and that they aren't being forced into either labor trafficking situations or also sex trafficking situations. And UNICEF also works to, for example, train law enforcement and Border Patrol officials and social workers and healthcare workers to be able to identify child trafficking victims. Very often, as you may know, they are looked at as criminals if they're trying to cross the border or if they're in a country illegally when in fact they've been trafficked. So a lot of the work that UNICEF does is capacity building and helping those different sectors to really understand that these children should be treated as victims and not as criminals. So that really depends on the government that you're working with. Some governments are very interested in these issues. Some governments have a lot more resources to be able to dedicate to child protection programs. And other governments, in some countries, if there has been civil war going on for a few years, sometimes there might not even be an official government in place. So it's obviously a lot harder to work with those institutions. But very often some of the work that UNICEF has done is create, more small-scale programs, and after a few years or a year of piloting that program, really show how that has had an impact on the community, and then work with the government to invest resources to bring that to scale, either on a countrywide level or in the areas that are most affected by these issues. So it depends on the government. So people at all different ages are trafficked. The work that UNICEF does is with children and sometimes parents as well, but children can be born into trafficking and slavery situations. So for example, in places like India, there are brick kilns, and often a parent might take out a loan of $10 to either provide food or perhaps medicine if a child is sick, and then if they can't pay back that money, they're forced to work in the brick kiln, and all of their work is used to pay back that loan. But very often what happens is it's not just the father who's taken out the loan, but the mother and all of the children are also forced to work in the brick kiln, and that can actually go on for generations. So sometimes a child will be born into slavery or trafficking situation in that brick kiln. And that will be their whole life experience. But other times it is, it happens for a portion of someone's life, but certainly children are trafficked from very young ages all the way through adulthood. So trafficking doesn't discriminate based on age, but children, because they're children and because they're more vulnerable to trafficking, are at a higher risk for it. Yes, absolutely. So a lot of the work that UNICEF does specifically with children in armed conflict is, if they were forced to be a soldier, it's demobilizing them and helping to reintegrate them into the community. And that works in several layers, because they're working to rehabilitate the actual child who's experienced the trafficking itself, but then they also work with the communities, because very often, as you may know from reading the book, the children may have been forced to kill community members. So very often the communities are hesitant for the child to return. So UNICEF works both to help rehabilitate the child, but also to educate the community on the fact that the child was forced to do this, and that's why they should be reintegrated into the community. So again, it's working with multiple different sectors to create a more holistic approach. No, so that's a different situation, but what is important to note is very often sometimes there's an overlap with those issues. So sometimes if children are fleeing some sort of conflict in their communities, or even if they've experienced a natural disaster, since their infrastructure has been dissolved, sometimes they've been separated from their families, and that all of those conditions make them more vulnerable to trafficking. So it's not that that entire population has been trafficked, but those circumstances certainly make them more vulnerable to traffickers. And often in those situations, you see that traffickers take advantage of those situations and know that children, but also adults, are at greater risk because they're more likely to take risks to leave their communities and also to find work. So all of those conditions make them more vulnerable. I think that can go in many ways. I think one of the largest effects is, trauma, whether that's both from labor trafficking or sex trafficking. Also, when it comes to children, very often they're separated from their families. They're no longer in school, which are all rights that all children have, is to go to school and to grow up with a family. Their childhoods are often taken away, and it's actually been shown in recent years that some research has been done on the effects of violence on children, and the effects that you see on the brains of young children who have experienced extreme violence can actually be very similar to the effects that malnutrition and issues like that can have. So it actually affects the development of the brain of the child. So I think the sooner that the child's able to be pulled out of that situation and start experiencing rehabilitation practices, the better off they'll be. But the circumstances can definitely be devastating, and I think just on a more basic level, they have a lack of trust. Very often, children who have been trafficked are exploited by people who might have grown up in the same community as them. They might have been family friends. Very often, they're known to the child, and that's supposed to be someone that children can trust. So once that person exploits them and traffics them, it's very hard for them to begin to trust people again moving forward in their lives. Thought was that, I know you guys asked if there were still demobilization going on in the work that UNICEF does, and actually very recently in the Central African Republic, UNICEF's been working with several different groups to have militia groups be released by the children, and I believe over 600 children at least have actually been released from armed groups, and a lot of that is facilitated by UNICEF and other UN agencies. So all of those children are now being reintegrated into their communities as well. So it's definitely something that is still a current issue and still very much a priority for UNICEF.
You can donate to organizations that work to prevent human trafficking in high-risk areas.
You can volunteer for organizations that help to stop human trafficking.
And you can educate yourself and others about the issues of human trafficking around the world.